Every day is made up of small fractions of stories, whether it's our
Yeah.
mother, our grandmother, our fathers, our siblings, cousins, telling you a story to fall asleep, telling you a story to keep you awake.
Yeah.
When you're cooking, they're telling you a story. When you're a baby and they're massaging you, they're telling you a story. And often I think these stories, at least in the generation of our parents and grandparents, they were drawn from memory. So there is a lot of reality in these stories as well. I don't know if you can write just for writing's sake. You have to have something to say, something that is
you
a
feel
necessity.
compelled. Yeah.
I would say more than compelled, it has to be a necessity. You have to,
Okay.
that has to be the only thing that you
Yeah.
want to do. You can't not do it. So you have to feel so strongly about a subject, almost obsessively, to give all your time, space, effort, energy, passion to it. And I didn't think I had that. And I just wasn't, quite frankly, interested in it either. I didn't think I had the talent either. Actually, an object is just an object until you infuse it with memory.
Yeah.
And only then does it become so full of life that actually sometimes it's more painful than having the person that it originally belonged to near you.
Welcome to the podcast, Achal.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is completely my pleasure. I'm very, very excited because you have so many keywords that where I am in my life currently, that I'm so looking forward to speak to you. You know, history, heirlooms, stories, portals, things, how they tell stories. So, like, these are really, really things that speak to me. I've also personally, in my own practice, really looking into all of these. So, I, of course, want to chat with you and go there. But before we do anything else, would you like to explain and introduce yourself to everybody who's listening to us right now?
Sure. My name is Anchal Malhotra. I would describe myself primarily as a writer, since I write in a variety of different genres. And I have worked in the past with material memory and culture, with oral history and ethnography, with all kinds of fine arts and art history, and also in general an interest, I think, in the stories that we tell ourselves and we tell others about ourselves.
Wonderful. Tell me something, Achal. What brought you into the idea of stories? I also know you have a family legacy of coming from a background of books. What is the first instant that you remember that that brought you here, like a story that encapsulated you, something that really caught your moment?
I don't know if there's just one. The way we are raised in the subcontinent, our every day is made up of small fractions of stories, whether it's our mother, our grandmother, our fathers, our siblings, cousins, telling you a story to fall asleep, telling you a story to keep you awake. When you're cooking, they're telling you a story. When you're a baby and they're massaging you, they're telling you a story. And often I think these stories, at least in the generation of our parents and grandparents, they were drawn from memory. So there is a lot of reality in these stories as well. And of course, a lot of our local landscape, our local myth there sometimes. So I can't pinpoint to one thing. I just remember, I think the most consistent thing for me is that I remember the sound of someone's voice when they tell a story and the animatedness that comes with it and the tenderness that comes with passing something down to another person.
Interesting. Something that catches your interest now, and something I think as adults that we do it, is something that the younger versions of ourselves also have had, held on to it or have had keen interest. Did you ever think about yourself, or because you also come from a publishing background in your own family history, thinking yourself as a writer, as an artist? I also know you've done printmaking and you've also had contextual background there. Did you feel that you would grow up and go into a direction like this? Was it as open for you since you came from a literary background? How was your journey navigating that?
Well, I think when I was born into a family that runs an old bookshop in Delhi.
Yeah.
And it was started by my grandfather in 1955. And sorry, it was started in 1953.
Okay.
And so I think when you grow up reading books, and books are sort of there like the wallpaper of your lives, you don't actually think that you're going to have something as good to say to ever be published in one of those books, because you're reading great literature since you're a child. And it is very daunting, right? It's very daunting. It's also really exciting. But I don't think I ever had the dream of becoming a writer, mostly because I saw how much dedication, hard work, and right. But more than that, I don't think I had anything to say. You know, you just, I don't know if you can write just for writing's sake. You have to have something to say, something that is a necessity.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I would say more than compelled, it has to be a necessity. You have to, like, that has to be the only thing that you want to do. You can't not do it. So you have to feel so strongly about a subject, almost obsessively, to give all your time, in space, effort, energy, passion to it. And I didn't think I had that. And I just wasn't, quite frankly, interested in it either. I didn't think I had the talent either. What I wanted to be always, since I was a child, was an artist. And so
as a visual artist.
Right, as a visual artist, exactly. And I studied to be a printer. So I specialized in metal engraving, but I studied everything from screen printing to woodcut to sculpture, photography, paper making, book making, really embedding myself in the things that use your hands.
Tactileness of it, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I loved it. I really loved it. You know, it was a childhood dream, and I think I realized it into a reality. And to your question of whether it was easy familiarly to do it, yeah, I think it actually was, because my parents, thankfully, are not the kind to push you to do one thing or the other.
Yeah.
Right. So that was never a challenge for me, which I know is for many people actually. Right, for a lot of South Asian people, to show people the merit of doing something creative is a challenge in itself.
Yeah.
And
it does not feel like it's a paying job.
I didn't come across that. Well, I mean, it depends, right? When you're creative, actually, you have a lot of skill sets that may not show on paper, but actually you imbibe a lot of things as you work in a studio, and it certainly teaches you resilience and how to be crafty in making a living for yourself. And a lot of, I think, the creative education, it encourages you to build jobs rather than fit into already existing things.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
So you do garner the skill sets for that.
You think growing up, what was it like growing in a household where, and it's a privilege, I feel like, you know, not every day, and not many of us are born into families where literature, literacy also, I'm not only saying literature, literacy also. I remember, you know, I grew up in a place where it wasn't I didn't come from a family where it wasn't discarded as, you know, why education is not as important, like you shouldn't be, but it never it was also not really encouraged or felt like, it could bring something, it could change something, often undermining the idea that, you know, education is only, you know, it's a checklist rather than it's a real life skill or something that you can, and creative education let alone. I also want to imagine how would it be growing up for you? Like, did you have different writers, artists, studio visits, looking at other people, also having a real life example of, like, you know, what it takes to build a creative career? How was growing up like that? Just take us through if you have some memories.
Not like that.
It wasn't? Oh, how lucky would that be?
Well, the thing is, my parents are not practicing artists. They're simply booksellers. And a bookseller is just another kind of shopkeeper, right?
But they didn't have like any walk-in, walk-outs, like working with any kind of...
But I was a child.
Okay.
So, no, it wasn't as romantic a life as I would have hoped. Not at all. In fact, they knew a lot of creative people, but I don't think that ever translated to their children interacting with creative people. The only thing I do remember is the privilege of being raised around books. And I will echo your thought that was a real privilege, because there are just so many people who don't have access to that kind of world building, that kind of travel, you know, because you can really travel through books. And they come to reading very late in life, in a very conscious way, right? So that being said, though, even though books were always around, I actually don't ever remember someone telling me I had to read a book. No one ever read books to me when I was a child. No one ever said, okay, you have to read the classics, you got to read this. No, I think that for me, I just gravitated to it because it was there, because I found it interesting. Books are a source of comfort and they are friends. But if I compare it to my siblings, I think I read a lot more than they did because, just quite frankly, nobody was telling us that you have to read this, this, and this, right? It wasn't,
It
yeah,
was your own
I think,
inclination as well. That
yeah,
it
I
was a
think my
match.
personal,
Yeah.
it was a, sorry, what?
I'm saying it's a match. You had the
Oh, yeah,
influence,
right.
but you also had an interest. Like the influence and the
Yeah,
interest could match together.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. But I don't think it was as romantic as as you make it sound.
I'm sure it could happen anytime
I
with your future.
well, the thing is, I do remember when we were really young, going to the bookshop when my grandfather still was there, and we would sit and read alongside him because he really encouraged it a lot, and he would love it if not just us but other children also. They would always come and sit and read, and there was one didn't always have to buy the book.
Yeah.
So I know of children that would come and sit and read the whole book, whether it be a comic or an asterisk or something, and never buy it because they couldn't afford it.
Could afford it.
But they would they could simply sit there all day and read, and no one would say anything. And I think that habit has continued in the shop.
Yeah.
So I think it's books should be available, right?
Absolutely.
You should be able to lose yourself in it if that's something you want to do.
Yeah. Tell me, can you take me through your own personal perspective and journey of how you've navigated? I know at the moment, you write, you're a writer. You've also been a printmaker. I don't know if you continue that practice or not. You've been into history. Oh, you don't. So we have that. But, your own struggle and your own ifs and buts of navigating your creative career because, there's no landmark or benchmark. Okay, you have to go this way. And it's also not, in my own personal journey also I've experienced like a lot of times, like you said, I came from fashion. I thought I wanted to have a creative career. And art never was in the scene. I never knew an artist myself, so let alone I thought I'll become an artist, and knowing that I had to pay my bills. So I thought the easiest, something that I could do, I want to do, and is also viable was fashion. So I studied fashion, did everything, and then thought, okay, now this is what I want to do. But realized it is exactly not what I want to do, and I stepped away. And then I got into the arts. So I'm just trying to say there's no one way. So I want to hear the messy side and how you've navigated and the real insight of what's happened all these years for you.
Well, I decided, as I told you at a very young age, that I wanted to study art, visual art. And I applied to several art colleges after high school. When you grow up in India, there are very limited things that you think art looks like.
Yeah.
And these are largely confined to still life painting, sculpture, photography, and abstract drawing, things like that. When you step outside, particularly into the Western world, and you see the abundance of, I suppose, the methodologies to create art, the ways in which people have learned things since a very young age, the access to material, the freedom
of
not
thoughts.
to say that I didn't have freedom. Yes, it's freedom of thought. Exactly. The world is just a lot larger than you think that it is. So I eventually moved to Canada at the age of 17, and I had applied to this wonderful university to study painting. It was called the Ontario College of Art and Design. And when I got there, I just got a rude shock because everyone is so much more talented than you, and they know everything. I had never even done life drawing before. I had never seen a naked model. I didn't know what Conte was. I didn't know how to stretch a canvas, because these are things that they had learned in their art high schools. And their world
they have their infrastructure also now, even in their schools, and they can take electives and all of that. And for us, art is really like the extra class, or just in schools. Nobody takes seriously often.
Correct. Exactly. So I think I really struggled. And I think mixed with that was a lot of reckoning with who you are in a Western world. It's not just the small questions of, oh, well, how do you speak English so well? But it's also, oh, well, you're supposed to look a certain way.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're from a cultural place, why aren't you making art about that place? And I think that I was just reckoning with a lot of things. Well, yes,
You're there.
yes, of course.
Hmm.
But the thing is, you have to arrive to that place yourself. If you
Yeah,
do choose to make, if you
absolutely.
choose to, right?
You know, I'll
And
tell you,
I just,
I just want to add to
hmm,
this. When I started painting, right, when I had come, and like you said, I was looking at different arts and everything.
Mm.
And I would
hmm,
say, you know, I can really specifically call myself out in so many instances. I would say, oh, I would never paint like the gods, and like, you know, how can we be so limiting that there's this only this expression, and why India only has to symbolized by these iconographies, or like, you know, why is everybody, you know, painting a traditional style which looks more cultural and everything. And I used to say that again and again, and for so many years, even if you look at my work today versus, let's say, 7 years back, they're highly contrasting. Like, you know, I had a very Western influence. It was still illustrative as it feels today, but it was a bit more modern, bit more culturally, it had the India colors, but it didn't have the iconography. But today, if you look, my work has so much influence. I'm doing exactly, I said something I would never do. And I would say, oh, why would do people? But now I understand. I'm not painting because I have to paint something. I'm painting because I have to say something. Something is so compelling that I don't have any other option, because my life trajectory and experiences have brought me to a point that I have to process, and I process through art, and there's no other way. You know, just circling back on what you said, that you have to arrive at those points. It's not like I come from here, so I will do this. No, I come from a life, and if that life takes me to a point that I can do this, and I may not, and I may. There's no fixed benchmark of that. Sorry, go ahead.
right, right. No, exactly. All of the things that you said. It's just that, you know, when you live in the West, the idea that someone else can tell your story is so crippling, because it's always been done,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
People speaking for you. I just realized living there that it's so important to put words, our own words, to our own story. And so that realization of drawing from where I came from to make either art or any kind of writing, it comes with time, it comes with age, it comes after walking through a rebellious phase of not wanting to do it or not being flattened by it.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, once you do it, the untrained eye will flatten all
Hmm.
influence to make it look like a generic Indian work or a generic
Hmm.
Indian artist or a generic Indian writer. And they will take away the diversity, the lived experience of it, right? So anyway, when I was in art school, I realized quite early on that I had no talent for painting, but what I loved very much was printing. The printing press was scientific and chemical, but also artistic in a way that
Yeah.
democratized our access to fine art. It
Yeah.
gave us the printed word. It fused technology and creativity together in this really beautiful mechanical art form. And I love that. And so I really spent time with the printing press and really devoted myself to it. And I think that's when I started thriving, because I understood that I need a bit of structure in my life, even in the form that I'm pursuing. And printing gave that to me. So I graduated with a degree in printing and art history. And then I also did my master's in metal engraving, where I taught engraving and then letterpress. That's the other thing I loved very much: setting type, making books, making paper, Japanese or Western. And I think I really, really felt myself shine there, because it was
It
something
spoke to you.
that, yeah, I think it just fused a number of my interests.
Yeah. And I think you like, you know, I also really love about printmaking. I'm not a printmaker. I've tried my hands a couple of times. But I think it's very good for people who need structure, who are a bit technically minded, but are also very creative. So it gives them a lot of good structure. So like, I think it's a very good
Absolutely.
medium.
Yeah, but it's very visceral and very bodily. And
Yeah,
I like the
absolutely.
fact that, yeah, you have to give a lot of
Yeah.
yourself to get something in return.
And also, I think it's
Yeah.
very surprising also. Like, you can't, even though you can predict the results, you really can't predict the results.
It's very hard. Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
hard. It's
Yeah.
always a shock or a good surprise. You know?
But then tell me, what brought you specifically your areas of interest, as I say, partition, pre-partition, history, heirlooms. A lot of your work rotates around these topics in keywords. Can you take us through the journey of how you arrived at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I was working on my master's degree, a lot of my image making became quite textual, and I started making art using actual words, sometimes image as words, sometimes word as image. I really gravitated to the blind emboss in letterpress a lot, leaving an imprint of something. And then, as you work on your thesis in grad school, you can pick any subject, but you just have to showcase it in a gallery. So I decided to work on partition because I didn't know anything about it. I didn't
Okay, you were
know.
curious.
Well, no, it wasn't so much curious as a bit ashamed that I didn't know anything about my
Okay.
grandparents' histories. All four of them
Hmm.
came from what became Pakistan, and the word was just never uttered. And at some point, I was home, and we began talking about it. My mother's family, and I was just shocked at the scale of it. I was shocked at the fact that someone I knew had lived through something
Yeah.
so momentous that had been taught to us in history books, but not with the same urgency and relevance that
Yeah.
would make us go home and ask about it.
Yeah. And
It was taught to us in a
humanization.
way that, well, yes, absolutely. It was taught to us in a way that was removed and really static,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it really made the binary of us versus them evident. Whereas in reality, it wasn't like that. Things were far more embroidered and embedded, and people were
Yeah.
far more connected to each other than the history books made us
Yeah.
realize. And so, talking to my family, I was really surprised at how immediate the event suddenly felt. And nobody wants to talk about it, though. When you ask questions, the unique thing about, I think, any event of trauma of this magnitude is when you ask questions about it, especially if it's an event in lived memory, the likelihood is that you will be asked a question back. Like if I
Yeah.
said, "Oh, tell me about partition," they would say, "Oh, why do you want to know? Or what do you know about it?"
Okay.
And I couldn't understand why the answer wasn't straightforward. And it took me a long time to realize the straightforwardness of that answer would never actually come, because that memory of partition was so embedded under feelings of shame, under feelings of losing your home, never going back, anger, violence, sadness, grief,
Yeah.
trauma, all of that is sort of enclosed within a really well preserved space inside
Yeah.
oneself. And the
Yeah.
people who lived through partition tried very hard to become that silent generation so that all of those memories would exist only in silence. And it takes a lot actually to interpret silence as well.
Yeah.
So, what I started asking, rather than saying, "Oh, tell me about partition," I started asking, well, what were the things you brought during partition? And what were the things you missed when you came here or when you went there? And all of a sudden, the shift from personal story to material culture,
Material, yeah.
right, became really apparent, because somehow people felt like the object didn't represent them, it just represented the time. And they started talking about the fact that they carried their books and they carried a pen, or they were only wearing a shawl and that's what they brought. And they told the story, yeah, but it suddenly became through the protagonist of the object. And so for my master's thesis, I did this project about migratory objects during partition. What did refugees carry when they left their homes, not knowing whether they would return?
Yeah. I love this because, my grandparents were also from the same, time and zone. And when we grew up, I remember, so my grandfather and my nanu nani, and my dadu dadi, both sides, they all came from Pakistan. And in fact, uh, my mother's side, a few of their cousins chose to stay there. And there's also their family friends, because not all came here. And so, as for my grandparents, because they had homes and lives that they didn't want to completely leave, or by the time the partition had happened and all of this. And I still remember, as young girl, I would sit and we would ask, when you're young, you you just ask your grandparents, oh, did you have this? What did you do while you were young? So they would tell us. And, it didn't matter to me like it was a pre-partition or partition, or it just, for us, they were people that we loved. They were people I really connected to, and how it felt for them growing up. And she would tell us, stories from, um, so my parents' side, my dadu side came from Lahore, and while my nanu side came from a different area. And I still remember, that is a very fond memory. And when my mom passed away, you also said something very relevant that I have only learned recently after her passing. My mom loved fashion. I've said this on the podcast so many times. And I always had this thing. I would say, why do you want to buy so many clothes? You want to have everything. And I also love collecting things. But also there's some, in the world that we live in, we also live in a very aware world. Like, if I'm spending, I would check myself. Am I overspending? Am I indulging into materialism, consumerism? But our parents, my mom, they didn't have it. If they wanted it, they just wanted it. They didn't have so many mental checks and things like that. So I would always be very concerned about the idea that why do you want to buy everything? And why does it have to be like, these are just clothes. Yeah, things like that. When she passed away, her physical form had gone. But, what changed for me, let's say I'm wearing something from her. I have her saris. I have, it's, even when I look at things, I now no longer look at them as things. I would tell, oh, this is something that, my mom gave me when this happened. Oh, I shared this with my mom and so I kept it here. Or if I want her presence, if I go any milestone, or if I have some important place to go or something, I would want to wear something. I would wear a sari. Even if it's washed, honestly, sometimes I still feel that she's in it. Then I realized, oh my goodness, these are not clothes anymore. And these are not things. They are these are time travel. Like, she's not here physically. But for me, these have become things for me to be able to carry her with me physically, to be able to feel that kind of intimacy. And it really changed my own perspective on how things are material, but also so much more beyond. Like, it's a story we tell while, when you look at my mom's clothes today, I can tell you can tell the kind of person she was, the choices she made, the fashion she wore, the colors she loved, how makeup influenced her, or how how conscious of her own persona she was. And it's a story. So, I mean, things as stories, materials as physical materials as in emotional stories. It's changed my perspective completely.
It really depends on how you look at it, right? For some people, for many people, in fact, an object is just an object. Actually, an object is just an object until you infuse it with memory.
Yeah.
And only then does it become so full of life that actually sometimes it's more painful than having the person that it originally belonged to near you. Because you take that almost entirely for granted. But when absence becomes a presence in itself, and it is almost a suffocating presence, then you realize the meaning of what it meant to be around that person, and again to view them in their natural setting, surrounding. And in this case, of course, it's your mother. But in the case of people that migrate from one place to another, not only partition, but any kind of migration, genocide, any form of moving from one place to another, the things you carry really show the state of your migration as well. And then, of course, there's the thing of, well, what do you wish you could have carried that you didn't carry? All of those things, they take you back to the kind of home that you had once built. And in the case of partition, many people who migrated were certain that they may go back one day, that this was just temporary, and then it never happened. And so you had all of these heartbroken people who had lived through unthinkable trauma and violence, and existed in a new kind of reality so far away from where they belonged.
Absolutely. Does it bother to you where we are today and the kind of history we are creating, specifically at
You
the
have to be
time?
more specific because everything bothers people these days. Everything is
Let
difficult.
me reframe this. Specifically the geopolitical situation. We are also, as we grow up, we've seen, our generation is also seeing a lot of uh, very traumatizing, life-changing, landmark moments.
Well, you see, the one thing I learned during partition is that actually human life has no value.
No value.
We can get over almost anything. Human
Yeah.
adaptability is enormous, right? So one of the ways in which we can honor the fact that we are human and carry a shared humanness within us is to have the respect and dignity for other people's experiences, to give them space, to give them an honor of being, which we don't do. I mean, actually, we don't even listen to people around us. The art of conversation and listening is lost in itself.
Yeah.
But we have also really the immediacy of everything. The immediacy of everything has really robbed us of the act of respect and waiting.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I feel sometimes I'm always trying to live a slower life as much as I can, and a smaller life. Maybe smaller is more appropriate than slower. And
what do you
it's
mean by
so-
smaller?
I mean, obviously, on one hand, very similar to the things that you were saying, that I'm not so interested in purchasing stuff. I'm not so interested in spreading myself very thin.
Yeah.
I'm not, even in the manner that I work, I'm not interested in churning out book after book or
Yeah.
selling out on the shelves. I'd rather, 20 years later, someone still be reading me because I spent 5 years to work on something that was long lasting. But I think also the respect that comes with working on books based on the things that people have said, I think for me, that is also an aspect of a slower, smaller life. Right? And I just don't see that respect for other people. Forget people far away in different parts of the world where active genocides are happening.
Yeah.
You also,
What we're
right?
looking at, witnessing.
Everything in your own country, in your own neighborhood. We have no, I don't know, there's too much falling apart all the time. And
Yeah.
somehow a way, a response
I think that's just
is to
last
feel
few years have-
existential about our own life rather than trying to help the world.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And we've also been taught like that. I think human conflict, our inner conflict is also such that we're often so engrossed with our own own conflicts and own traumas and own struggles, and while the awareness of what's happening in the world, but we're also daily fighting with our own so many of us are just dealing with their own things, that in spite of knowing what's happening, there's very little that people do. But also, what bothers me specifically, I'm a person who's gone to the West, lived those, and really come back home, like, and by West, I mean, like, we've done the technology, we've seen, and we've seen different phases in our life. Like, while we've grown up, we've had the pre-technology, pre-internet time, how one used to connect to each other, what letters meant, what going to the market, like, while, a lot of my work is very, very tactile because I use a lot of Indian embellishments, I use a lot of surface embellishments because they come from my own memory. While I was young, my mom was really obsessed with, things and apparel and making things. So she would go into these really tiny lanes and, we would buy fabric and then embroidery, and then she would put them together, and then we would go to a tailor. So that experience literally shaped me. And also because I grew up in a smaller town, so, looked at things very closely, and it very subconsciously influenced me. So a lot of my work is very tactile, but also knowing that the world that we live in today, that tactileness is going away. Like, a very big reason when I realized that I wanted to be an artist was also because I wanted to do things by hand. I didn't want to manage a factory. I wanted to make a product. I wanted to feel the physical aspect of, and the urge to create something. And I feel like in a time that we're moving forward, we're also eliminating the tactileness. Let's say even not in the material world, but the physical intimacy, the touch of each other, there's nothing better than your grandparents holding your hands. And I miss that. Like, I miss my mom's hand, the touch of her hand, or, just so many experiences that were very physical in nature, while a lot of things have started to move digital. What do you feel like? How do you, what's your viewpoint on that?
Similar to yours. Uh, but actually in my work, all of this intimacy is there because I spend my days recording other people's stories. So there is actually a
Okay.
lot of intimacy, but it's a conscious choice, right?
Yeah.
Because it's an anomaly in today's world.
Yeah.
The fact that you can sit in front of somebody, record their story, if they start crying, reach out and hold their hand, it means something, right?
Yeah.
And I think I've taken a very conscious choice to have a career that allows me to do that, to really listen to the
Yeah.
voice, not just hear it, right?
Yeah.
But I
Okay.
understand it's fading. It's definitely
Hmm.
fading. And I don't think generations that are born now will really understand the intimacy and actually, moreover, the community life that used to hold society together.
Absolutely. Can you tell me a little about your project, the Museum of Memory? I'm Material Memory. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I got it right. Do you want to talk about it? What is it? Archiving physical memories digitally. What that means? Why did you start the project? What are you
Yes.
trying to do with it?
Absolutely. So I started the project along with a school friend of mine, actually, who I've known since we were 15 years old, I think. It's called the Museum of Material Memory, and it's a digital repository of material culture. In simple words, it's a digital museum. And the reason why the museum is digital is because it tries to cover all of South Asia, all of the Indian subcontinent, different countries within it that often bear the burden of having highly militarized borders. So they cannot have as active communication physically as they normally would. And so a digital platform is something that remains accessible to all of us.
Yeah.
And we really strive for accessibility and democracy in terms of art making and art giving. So we made this digital platform where South Asians from different parts of the world, and of course the countries of South Asia, could submit stories of objects that were dear to them and artifacts that had been passed down in their families. They didn't really have to be valuable objects, like it doesn't have to be jewelry or a beautiful piece of fabric. It can also just be a book or a notebook or a cigarette case or a small camera that you may have somehow inherited or may just be staying, like living in your house on a shelf, right?
Yeah.
The idea is to try to ask questions about things that shape us and people that shape us, people that, like similar to, let's say you inherit a sari from your mother and you remember very specifically where she wore it, and it has really shaped, it's like a formative experience of yours. And so we would invite someone like you to write, 800 to 1,000 words about that. And the point is to have an alternative archive of material culture that surpasses what we may see in official museums in different parts where things are behind glass, but there is very
And
little
also controlling
intimacy
the
with
narrative. I really like that about this open source.
we control the narrative, or they do?
No, I think in museums,
Yeah.
they decide what's valuable to be
Right.
put.
Well, they control the narrative. We
Yeah.
diversify the narrative, right?
Yeah.
We humanize the narrative.
Yeah.
So an object is not just an ink pot from 19th century India. It is a very specific ink pot that once belonged to a family that used it in this way. And I think when you infuse memory with material culture, really, there is such a magic that happens because you
Yeah.
see how the object comes to life because it's used in life.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a static thing. It's something that was once beloved or used or shared on an everyday basis.
Yeah.
So the museum is really an attempt to put together a living archive of things that make us collectively South Asian.
I love that. I think this is a wonderful project. And also, I think what I really like and love about this idea is that, when you go to a museum or like, how shape, even history is never real. Like, it's also tampered and viewed and shaped from a perspective of few. It's really not
Yes.
as democratized as we think and believe as factual it is. But when we don't decide what's really worthy to be documented, and either the ordinary or on the top of the shelf, but the openness of how your life and my life both tell a different story. Your context of how you come from, where you live, and where I come from and where I live,
Right.
and your experience and our experience, even if we're using the same object, it may tell so many different stories about our own cultural text, like context.
Completely. And actually, that's a really good point, because we often see submissions from different parts of South Asia. Let's say someone from Nepal sends something, and someone from Kerala sends something, and they're the same kind of object.
Yeah.
Could be a utensil used in the kitchen, but it could be used for very different things, but look identical, and obviously have two very different familial biographies.
Yeah. When I started the podcast, I felt I was alone. I felt, I'm feeling this way. This is my journey. And something switched with me as I started speaking to a lot of different people. And these were people from all different walks of life, from US, America, Europe, Canada, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, like different, really different. And I realized two things: how no matter where we came from, a lot of similarities still stayed. Our experiences as women, we may be in a third world, first world, second world, different worlds of country and time and situation. But the center of it still hasn't really, like the crux of it, still very similar. How we are so different, yet so similar. I also, that was my realization, especially as an artist, because I felt like, I thought, I come from India and that's only with me. And then I realized, no, that's also in the US, that's also in Canada, that's also in Europe. And it's actually, it's exact the same thing. And I'm really not alone. It's so many of us. And, I also work with a lot of Southeast Asian. My team we work globally. I have so many people from different parts of the country now, and specifically Southeast Asia. And we have people from beyond that also. And we also still realize like how we're so different, yet so similar. Like we may speak different languages, but the essence of them still similar. We may follow different religions, but there is so much of commonality that you can really not pick apart from different detailings of it. That, the similarities, even in the dissimilarities, I think that's so, there's always this tying thread that's also tying so many of us as women, us as cultures and societies, and role of women in it. So I think that's, when you put these common stories in one ground and pot, and then you relook at them and you realize, oh my God, there's really like not 10 different narratives. A lot of similar experiences are being shared all over the world. Like we still are navigating a very similar problem.
What kind of things?
You would tend to believe, let's say, misogyny. We come from a patriarchal community and setup, and India or Southeast Asia still has a lot of acceptance. And we know, and we've been, trying to change that fact. But it's not as changing even in the West, even though how forward it looks and how modern it feels. But the roots of it still, a lot of us are just fighting a lot of similar problems disguised differently. I was reading again the book of, I really love the book, Palace of Illusions. And, every time I read that book, I feel like, oh my God, how many years have we come forward in time? But really, what Draupadi fought for herself and her viewpoint. And that is, again, a woman's version of Draupadi, and how men put it is a different picture. But it, even the book was written 15 years ago, and I reread it here. And then she's writing about a character that is thousands of years ago. So there's literally a trail. And if you see what she felt as a writer 15 years ago, investigating and writing a biography of Draupadi, looking for self-identity, finding her own voice, being navigating herself in a man's world. Like a lot of those things are still the same, are perception towards have evolved, our problems have evolved, we've made progress, sure, but it's still similar ground. So like even though times have changed, contexts have changed, the foundation in the area of our problems is still circle around the same idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah, fortunately, unfortunately, maybe, or I sometimes think like, how that's true. Like in our language, roti kapda makan, where people say food, if you have good food on the table, if you have decent clothes to wear and you
Clothes
have a
on your
roof over your head, that means like a lot of your basics are covered. And a lot of our cultural issues and a lot of everything rotates around these situations only, because these are the basic structures of our existence. And probably maybe they do have some kind of relevance to it, I'm sure. Okay, tell me something. I'll ask you a couple of quick questions. Okay, so let's do a rapid fire with you, Achal. Okay, here's our first question. One object in your home you'd never part with.
Oh, gosh, I don't know. A watch that once belonged to my grandfather's sister.
Okay. Tea or coffee while writing?
Coffee.
Okay. The partition object that moved you the most?
Difficult to say. I think it was the ordinary objects, the lock that someone had brought from their home, the set of keys, the dupatta that they wore on the way when they came,
The details of it. A scent that instantly takes you back in time? Okay, of course. Morning person or a night owl?
Recently, morning person.
Okay. So you like to write early hours?
Yeah, but when I was writing my last book, I wrote very, very late into the night.
Okay.
But recently, quite early.
Oh, wow. Your go-to creative escape other than writing?
Probably music.
Music. What kind of music do you sing or something, or do you love to hear?
No. God, no. No, I would never. No, it's just listening to music, and I usually just listen to classical music, Indian or Western.
Okay. A city whose history you'd love to archive next?
Calcutta.
What takes you there?
Oh, it's fascinating. It's a port city. Number of different communities live there. That means it's a syncretic city as well. And it's also a very aged city. Like it has perceptible history in every road,
They also have a lot of culture. Like they've really kept it together. One word people should associate with your work?
I don't know. What do you think?
If you were to see from the lens I come, I would say heirlooms.
Oh, okay. I would probably say like intimacy.
Intimacy.
Something quite intimate, yeah.
First book that made you fall in love with storytelling, history, culture, anything like?
Those are all very different things.
Let's say stories, because primarily everything comes under that.
Okay. Well, a few years ago, I read this book, The Reader. It's written by Bernard Schlink. It has a great film based on it as well with Kate Winslet in it. And I read that book very quickly because it's a very thin book. And I thought that I didn't understand it. And then I read it again much slowly. And it taught me so much about how to tell a story that I think it was a really important lesson for me. So I really see it as like a formative book, The Reader.
I'm going to link that here, The Reader.
Sure.
Last question. An artist living or dead you'd love to have coffee with?
Amrita Shetty.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Achal. It was so nice speaking to you. I really
It was a pleasure.
Learn a lot.
Yeah.
And I hope we catch up soon again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and for having me on.
Absolutely. One last thing. Where can people,
Yes.
if they want to see the museum, if they want to know more about your work, buy the books, look into your work, where can they find you, support you?
Well, the museum is present online since it's digital. You can go to the museumofmaterialmemory.com and you can find me on Instagram or my website. And for books, if you do end up buying my books, I would love it if you buy them from a local bookshop.
Absolutely.
Just to support your local businesses. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Achal. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a good day.
Thank you. You as well. Bye.